I'm the Supergrass who doesn't exist. I turned into killers. Now there's a £5,000 bounty on my head. Officially, he no longer exists. He doesn't have a national insurance number, a passport, a driving licence, or even a bank account. He still lives with his wife and children, but none of them will ever see their friends again. The only contact with relatives is the occasional letter passed by the police. Darren Nichols is a Supergrass. His evidence was critical in convicting the 2 drug barons responsible for the Essex Range Rover murders 3 years ago. He may have escaped prison, but he still faces a life sentence, living far away from his home in rented accommodation and surviving on just £48 a week dole money. But every day he has to live his life with the fact of one of Britain's most wanted informers. He has a £5,000 price on his head. Just one slip, one telltale clue could put gangland executioners on the trail of him and his family. I've heard that I'm supposed to be out in South Africa and that I've got a suntan, said 33-year-old Nichols. The reality is nothing like that at all. They never give you a villa abroad, and most countries won't take you because you're a criminal. They take away your national insurance number and your driving licence is erased. They take you off the computers, they just vanish you. Everything is a constant lie. I've been offered a few silly jobs, but I can't take them. I don't exist. I ain't even got a bank account. You get the most basic dole money, they find you somewhere to live, and then expect you to get on with your life. But it's just really awkward. People living near me are starting to wonder. I don't think I'll ever be rid of this. Nichols' critical testimony at the Old Bailey led to Michael Steele and Jack Worms being jailed for life for the executions of rival drug barons Pat Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. He drove the getaway car after Steele, 55, and Worms, 37, lured their 3 rivals to an isolated farm track near Basildon. After promising them a share in a cocaine drop, when the 3 men arrived in a Range Rover, they were blasted to death. Nichols said he had no idea what was happening. I assumed that I was driving to a drug deal between Mick and Jack and the men in the Range Rover and that. When they'd completed the deal, they would call me on their mobile and I'd pick the pair of them up. When I was phoned to come and collect them, I drove into the lane and turned the car around to face back towards the road. Jack got in the back, then Mick got in, and then the interior light on the car came on. That's when I noticed Jack was wearing white gloves covered in blood. Mick told me to get going. As I started to pull away, Mick started passing the barrels of the gun over to Jack. I thought, fucking hell, what's going on here? Mick said, they won't fuck with us again. And that's when I realised someone had been killed. During last year's trial, the court heard how Worms described himself as an angel of death and boasted that he'd done the world a favour. Nichols said, I don't remember a lot about the journey back. As far as I was concerned, it passed in 2 seconds. It was probably half an hour. I just couldn't comprehend what had happened. I tried to forget about it, and I went to the pub and had a bit of a drink. The next day I went back to work. I just tried to carry on as normal, but there was no way I could. In the days that followed, Nichols became increasingly wary of the men he had first met in jail while serving time for counterfeiting. He said, they realised that I was a weak link, but they got more friendlier towards me. They wanted me to do things with them. They wanted me to go flying. Mick was egging me on to come flying and betting that I couldn't identify my town from an aeroplane, things like that. He said, we'll go flying, me and you. And then when he turned it with Jack with him, he said Jack could just sit in the back. I thought, there's no fucking way I'm getting in there playing with those 2. It was not long afterwards that Nichols, whose story is told in the BBC's One's Inside Story, decided to tell everything he knew whilst being quizzed about drug offences. His wife, who has not been named for security reasons, said, it must have been around midnight when I got a call from Darren. He asked if I wanted to be with him, and I said, of course. He said he couldn't tell me anything and that I should pack an overnight bag for me and the kids, and if we did what he asked, we would be all right. The police turned up sometime later. The children were asleep. I had to get them out of bed. I can't remember what I told them about where we were going, but they were so sleepy they didn't really take much notice. Choking back the tears, she added, I I remember thinking I'm probably not coming back here. I don't know why I knew, but I just did. Mrs. Nichols and her children were moved between safe houses as they waited for the trial to start. Nichols was kept first at a secure unit in Bedford, then moved to an IRA wing on the Isle of Wight. Mrs. Nichols added, "I was like a prisoner. I couldn't go out. I had to rely on a policewoman to take me to the shops. Most of the time, me and the children just sat in the house. We had a television and one sofa. My family couldn't visit. They didn't know where I was. They weren't allowed to know. I was scared. I didn't know what was going on. I had panic buttons and alarms all over the place. There was armed police." The stress got too much for Mrs. Nichols. She phoned her husband and told him that he wasn't with her within a week. She was going home, but the police would not let her leave. "They told me I was in danger," she said. "They said Mick and Jack had loads of contacts in the underworld. They knew dangerous people. They said, you can't go home, you're putting your children in danger, and if you do that, they could be taken away from you." So that was that. Nichols said, "My wife was having a breakdown on the phone, and all I could do was just sit there." But despite all the anguish his family had been put through, former drug runner Nichols said he has no regrets. "Of all the Supergrasses in the system, I am the tops," he boasted. "I am considered a major witness. The police really do feel that everyone wants me dead. There's a bounty in my head. I'm not sure how much it is. Some say it's 250,000, others say it's 500,000. But who's going to collect it? Who'd you collect it from?" At the trial, I tried not to look at Worms and Steele. They scared me because of what I was doing to them. Obviously they hate me, and I don't think I'll ever be rid of them. Mick's quite old, and hopefully he'll die in prison. And Jack, hopefully, when he gets out, he'll be much older and wiser, and will just get on with his life, rather than try to have his revenge. If their sentences are quashed, I'm particularly worried about what will happen. No one likes the truth, especially the families of the people who did it, but it's something they've got to come to terms with, not me. The family of Jack Worms, who was last week refused leave at the High Court to appeal against his sentence, denied any knowledge of a price on Nichols' head. Worms' brother John said, "We need him alive, because he's the only person who can prove that Jack didn't do it." But former Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley, who headed what turned out to be the biggest ever murder inquiry in Essex, had no doubt that Nichols is telling the truth. It would almost be impossible for someone like Darren Nichols to actually make up the detail that he gave in court. But whatever happens to Worms and Steele, Nichols still has to come to terms with him being a prisoner, probably for the rest of his life. Now, when it came to the prosecution's case against Jack Worms and Michael Steele, there were seemingly big holes in Darren Nichols' version of events. Things that happened on the 6th of December 1995 that simply could not be explained, nor did they fit in with the day of murder story of the Supergrass. Now, Nichols had claimed that the killings took place between 6:45 and 7 p.m, but not a single gunshot was heard during that time, despite experts saying these should have been audible for at least a mile away. However, at about midnight on the 6th of December, or the 7th of December, an independent witness heard about 6 gunshots in the area of Rettendon. That is the statement of Stephen Rogers, which was taken on the 13th of December. Now, he says during the evening of the Wednesday on the 6th of December, he was working in his village hall, and as he finished the hall around about 11:15, he returned home and he was making a sandwich and a couple of cans of beer before going out to the stables to feed his fowl. And he would estimate the time to be around about 11:45 when he was doing this. And he says outside, when he was out the side of the stables, he heard a series of gunshots, and he believes they came from the southern direction. He walked to the fence at the near of the stables to try to see where the shots had come from, but he saw nothing. Although it was very cold and very late, if he'd only heard 2 gunshots, he wouldn't have took much notice. But he then goes on to say that he thought it was somebody shooting rabbits, and the gunshots he heard were more than 2 in a number. They were of a rapid fire. Now, there was no pause to reload in between the shots. He goes on to say that he couldn't say how many shots there were. goes on to say that after he heard the first 2 shots, he did expect the noise to stop, but it just continued. After these shots, he didn't hear anything else. He remained out in the stables for approximately 10 more minutes before returning home. When he reached home, he checked his wristwatch and discovered that the time was around about 12:30. You do believe Billy Jasper's version of events, which he did drop off someone in the area of Rettendon just after midnight. But according to Darren Nichols' version of events, the shootings took place between 6:45 and 7 p.m. The defence did ask whether these shots that were heard at midnight were connected to the killing or simply a bizarre coincidence. Also, there's the white escort van which was seen leaving the murder scene at Workhouse Lane at 7:45 approximately, again by an independent witness. This was nearly an hour after Nichols says the murders were committed. Was it turning around? Had it been a couple driving to the well-known spot for lovers? Graham Parkins QC, defending Steele, said it was a strange coincidence that another vehicle was in the quiet country track on that snowy night. Workhouse Lane is hardly Spaghetti Junction, he said. Not a single shred of forensic evidence could be produced against the 2 defendants, but the jury decided the evidence of Supergrass Nichols was enough. Other questions remained unanswered about evidence or lack of it at the murder scene. Jack Womes is a big, heavy-built man with size 12 feet. Supergrass Nichols had said that he was wearing Wellington boots when he dropped him off at the lane, but not a single footprint was found which could match that of Womes, or even Steele for that matter. It had been snowing and the ground was firm, but defence lawyers said there should still have been some marks left. When the so-called getaway car, a VW Passat, was recovered, it was searched for any splatters of blood and not one bloodstain was found. It was also claimed that if Womes and Steele had gunned the 3 down at close range, they would have been splashed with blood. Yet none was found in the Passat itself. Now, when it came to the actual arrest of Darren Nichols, when he was caught with the 10 kilos of cannabis, he stood next to his car, the small, stocky-built man, excluding confidence, despite the fact he'd been stopped by the police and was carrying drugs with a street value of up to £250,000. Darren Nichols barely turned a hair and laughed. "It's chocolate bars, isn't it?" Nichols' bravado was based on his position as a police informer. For almost a year, he'd been passing on information about fellow drug dealers and had developed a close relationship with 2 police handlers. Unfortunately for Darren, shortly after his arrest, on the May the 13th, 1996, he received some very bad news. Both of these police contacts were themselves under arrest and facing charges. Worse quickly followed. In addition to the drug offences, he was told he was being charged with the murders of Pat, Tony and Craig 6 months before his actual arrest. Mobile phone records showed that Nichols had been close to the murder scene on the night in question. He was a known drug dealer and former associate of Pat, so Darren knew he was in serious trouble and made a decision. On May the 15th, 96, Darren started to talk, making the first of more than 20 statements. He named his friends Jack Womes and Mick Steele as the murderers and claimed he'd been duped into driving the getaway car. He stuck to his story in court and, in the face of glaring inconsistencies, a jury believed him. Gave Womes and Steele triple life sentences. Now, Darren Nichols met Womes and Steele in Hollesley Bay Open Prison. He was finishing a sentence for counterfeiting, having been caught with £130,000 worth of forged £10 notes. Mick Steele was at the end of a 9-year sentence for cannabis importation. Steele was someone who Nichols admired. Jack Womes was altogether very different. He had no previous criminal record and was serving just 16 months after foolishly being involved in a fraudulent car insurance claim. Nichols had latched on to Steele and Worms at Hollansley Bay, and after all three had completed their sentences and had been released, he seemed determined to maintain their friendship. It meant Nichols knew all about their habits and movements, a lot believing that Darren Nichols was actually an undercover policeman and put inside to get close to Mick Steele and Jack Worms, possibly to do with importation. But at that time, Jack Worms and Mick Steele hadn't started their importation, so mainly it was for Darren Nichols to get close to Mick Steele. If one of the conspiracy theories is that he was an undercover police officer. As it has come out over the years, various people that knew Darren Nichols from school have come forward to say he wasn't a police officer and he was literally just someone who sold a bit of smoke. Now, just like the book Blogs 19 and the movie Rise of the Foot Soldier, Nichols told the police on the night of the 6th of December 1905 he travelled with Worms and Steele to the Wheatsheaf pub in Retterton, expecting to pick up a consignment of cocaine. Nichols had driven his own VW Passat, accompanied by Worms, while Steele had driven his Toyota Hilux. Nichols said he'd waited in the car park until a dark blue Range Rover pulled up, which was carrying Pat, Tony and Craig. According to Nichols, Steele joined Tate in the Range Rover and it pulled away. Sitting in the Passat, Jack Worms told Nichols to drop in at nearby Workhouse Lane, the eventual scene of the murders. Worms said he would phone when he needed Nichols to collect him. At 7 p.m, the call came. According to Nichols, it was only when a blood-splattered Worms and Steele clambered into the Passat that he realised a murder had taken place. He was shocked and he almost collided with a white van as he drove away, which is quite funny considering there is a witness report of a white van leaving the lane a little bit later than Darren describes there, 40 minutes later. But instead of Darren's Passat colliding with the white van, it is the white van leaving the lane. Despite his revulsion and horror, he vividly recounted in court for 6 months that Nichols made no mention of these events. As an electrician, he continued his work rewiring Mick Steele's new house. He told the court Worms and Steele were planning to murder him, but thought nothing of taking his wife and young children on repeated social visits to Steele's house. If Nichols is telling the truth, his conduct is hard to explain. But Nichols has a long record of lying and fabricating evidence, as he admitted in court. During the murder trial, evidence offered by tracing mobile phone calls was critical. Records from Nichols' Orange phone and Worms' Vodafone put both the men in the Retterton area at around 7 o'clock on the night of the murders. Worms' phone records showed he had made 2 calls to Nichols at 6:59. The first lasted less than 2 seconds and cut off. Worms' second call lasted for 4 seconds. Nichols' story is that Worms was calling him from the murder scene on Workhouse Lane, telling Nichols, "Come and get me." The police used this evidence, plus the fact that none of the 3 deceased used their phones after 6:44 to fix the time of death at just prior to 7 p.m. Now, part of that could be that there are phone records that show that there was calls made, but they've never been released by the Essex police to fit in with Darren Nichols' version of events. Now, Jack Worms told a different story. A professional mechanic, Worms agreed he'd driven to Retterton that night, but he said he'd taken a trailer to pick up Nichols' broken down VW Passat. The car had been left in the car park of the Wheatsheaf pub where Nichols claims the meeting with the doomed gangsters took place. Worms said he loaded the car onto the back of the trailer and phoned Nichols to tell him, but Worms only heard static and the call was terminated. Despite Nichols' lurid description of Worms entering the Passat dripping with blood, forensic tests failed to link the cars to the murders. In court, mobile phone experts argued for several days over whether it was possible to determine Worms' location where he called Nichols. It is generally agreed that the jury were confused by technicalities. It has taken 2 years for the defence team to get Worm's mobile phone for tests to prove his story. Their repeated requests were greeted with obstructions. Expert David Bristow finally made his tests in January of this year. It is important to understand that in certain places, a mobile call can connect to one of 3 or 4 different servers. Worm's call connected to what is known as a Hockley 54.3 server. David Bristow made 20 test calls from the Wheatsheaf pub car park where Worms said he was, and 40 calls from the murder scene on Workhouse Lane, not one connected with the Hockley Tower. As David Bristow points out, the calls were made with Worms' own phone at the same time of year as the murders and the same time of day. The conclusion seems inescapable when Jack Worms says he was in the Wheatsheaf car park and not at the murder scene. He was telling the truth. There is, of course, a postscript to this. If Darren Nichols wasn't driving Jack Worms in his Passat, just what was he doing that night in Rettendon? Having made his statement to the police, Darren Nichols was placed on the protected witness programme. All such prisoners are eventually given new identities, and in the meantime they are known as blogs. Nichols was blogs 19. Whilst awaiting for the murder trial, Darren spent most of his time in a secure unit at Woodham in Milton Keynes. Now, back about 21 years ago, around about in the year 2000, one of the witnesses in the protective custody of Milton Keynes contacted a journalist who had seen their previous articles on the Essex murders and, like Nichols, was called a blogs. He was referred to as the Professor. The Professor said he met Nichols at the Woodham unit, a fact that Nichols confirms in a recent newspaper article. The Professor remembers Nichols as a nervous wreck who drove the police handlers mad with his enormous demands and suicidal threats. Early in 1997, the Professor says Nichols asked to speak to him in private. He said the story he was supposed to tell in court was a pack of lies. Nichols asked the Professor if he should go through with it. His reply was simple. If Nichols was telling lies, he'd better not get caught. Not long after the conversation, Darren Nichols was granted bail. The Professor told the journalist he assumed that Worms and Steele were guilty and he wasn't unduly bothered. I thought there was forensic witnesses. I could ignore Darren's perjury because I thought it was just the cherry on the cake. Now I realise Darren wasn't the cherry on the cake. He was the cake. After seeing the various articles on Nichols and the trial, the Professor understood what the trial judge pointed out. The entire case rested on Darren's testimony. In court, Darren claimed that Steele had decided to murder Tate, Tucker and Rolfe because of ill feeling against the failed cannabis deal. Nichols' earlier statements tell a very different story, but the motive he first suggested cannot possibly be true, for the simple reason that such a motive didn't exist until 6 weeks after the 3 men died. Between February the 7th and 18th in 1996, 2 months after the murders, Mick Steele received a number of threatening phone calls. The calls were apparently from 2 IRA men demanding a return of money they had lent Pat. When Steele said this was nothing to do with them, they threatened to kill him. He became suspicious, and rightly so. In fact, the IRA men were police involved in a bizarre bid to get information on the murders. Darren heard about the calls when he was doing electrical work at Mick Steele's house. He claimed in his police statements that Steele murdered Pat because Pat had told the Irishman that Steele had their missing money. Unfortunately, neither Nichols nor the interviewing officers realised that Irishmen were undercover police, nor did they remember that the Irishman only materialised 6 weeks after Pat's death, and so could not provide a motive for his murder. When the error was spotted, the Irishman disappeared from Nichols' statements. The tapes of Darren's police interviews include odd gaps, missing words and background noises. Defence specialists concluded they had been tampered with. The highly eccentric nature of his testimony and his apparent reliance on police guidance can be seen on the screen now. Also, Shockingly enough, when Darren was in court, he was asked, "Are you a truthful man?" And Darren's reply was, "Not particularly." Now, in a newspaper article from the Evening Echo from '97, Darren apparently admitted that his reason for not coming forward earlier to admit about the murders was that he feared he would spend his days in jail. Graham Parkins QC, defender of Steele, told Nichols in court, "You are both a blatant and persistent liar, an opportunist, I suggest, grasping at straws to save yourself." He told the jury in court that Nichols did not name Worms and Steele as the killers until after the police had arrested him for the murders himself in May of '96. Darren admitted that he did not want to set up 54-year-old Steele of St Mary's Road, Great Bentley, and Jack Worms of Main Road, Bruffolk. But he claimed his plan was to pass on information about their drug deals to a police officer who was dubbed Detective Constable A by the court, and denied dreaming up the tale of murder. Mr. Parkins told him, "I suggest by December the 6th you knew Mr. Steele very well and had the means to make up a plausible story about him and his colleagues." Nichols replied, "Yeah, if I wanted to do so, but they did do the killings." Steele sat shaking his head in the dock as Nichols replied, and Mr. Parkins continued, "Are you falsely accusing these men when you know who was really responsible?" Nichols said, "They did it." Mr. Parkins responded, "You want to protect yourself and others who are not before the court." Nichols replied adamantly, "No, they did it." He admitted his main aim in becoming an informer for Detective Constable A was to get Worms and Steele arrested. Mr. Parkins, clicking his fingers, told him, "You had the means to get them arrested just like that." Nichols said, "Yeah, but because I gave them a lift that night, I felt involved. I thought I could spend my whole life in prison." Mr. Parkins told the court, Detective Constable A, who he described as corrupt, was friends with the boss of a company that electrician Nichols had worked for, and the pair often went clay pigeon shooting together. A forensic scientist who gave evidence at the beginning of the trial received the cartridges used to shoot Tate, Tucker and Rolfe was size 7.5, popular with clay pigeon shooters. When he was cross-examined in the Old Bailey dock, Nichols was clearly uncomfortable and often angry. He admitted being an informer for the corrupt officer who was referred as Detective Constable A. But Steele's defence, Graham Parkins, told him, involved in illegal activities with him and you profited from what the officer did and what he allowed you to do. Darren only got to know the policeman only weeks after the shootings, and Mr. Parkins claimed they plotted to board a North Sea ferry and steal £150,000 being taken abroad to buy drugs. They planned to make amphetamines from it and use it to set up two men who had displeased Nichols. They were also accused of stealing drugs and dishing them out like sweets. Arranged for Nichols to sell drugs to customers, then pass them on their names to Officer A so he could arrest them and win promotion. Told senior police officers about 60 kilos of dead cannabis, which Nichols had dumped in a gravel pit, and then blamed two innocent men for potting it there. The officer also let Nichols receive a £400 reward for his public spiritualists and bought him drinks together to celebrate. Nichols claimed he only came involved with the officer in a bid to get back at the two men he claims killed, Tate, Tucker and Rolfe, after they fell out over a cannabis deal. There was no limit to what I would do to try and get him to arrest Worms and Steele, Darren admitted. But Mr. Parkins rejected his claim. Despite what you and Mr. A were up to, you never once told me, even when it was raised, the question of Rettendon that you claimed to know who had committed these murders. Nichols admitted he hadn't. When questioned about Officer A by other police, Nichols claimed he was just an informer. But when his officers told him they had recordings of his telephone conversations with Detective Constable A, he said, "Oh dear," and laughed. Nichols told the court, "I laughed because the tape didn't matter to me. Compared to the trouble I was in, it was nothing." Mr. Parkins, pointing out at seeing the worm, said, "Yes, and by then you had made allegations in another direction." But Mr. Nichols, how does one know when you are lying and when you are not?